My name's Lacey Smith. I am a mom to a 14-year-old girl who has an ultra-rare diagnosis of Ogden syndrome. She's one of about 170 in the world. Because of her, I've been on this kind of rare journey, and I went back to school to become a teacher of students with visual impairments, and really I've been passionate about supporting the rare disease community and understanding CVI. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll go ahead and get started because I've already taken enough time. So today we'll discuss what is CVI, when to suspect CVI, CVI voices, general supports, next steps and resources and supports for families, and then we'll leave some time for questions. So what is CVI? CVI is the leading cause of childhood blindness. It's often misunderstood and underdiagnosed. A study from the UK showed that 1 in 30 children in mainstream classrooms may have CVI-related visual difficulties. And a study that Perkins teamed up and did with McKinsey and Company showed that less than 20% of children and young adults with CVI in the US are being diagnosed. So CVI is a brain-based visual impairment caused by damage or disruption to the visual pathways of the brain. There's a lot of different reasons this could happen. It's characterized by functional vision problems that cannot be adequately explained by the structural problem with the eye. So it's brain-based, it's not ocular-based, but you can have both. The visual centers of the brain have difficulty processing and interpreting information. And a lot of times what we see with individuals with CVI is that they really struggle with visual attention and visual recognition, really resulting into lack of access to their world. And all manifestations of CVI are a big deal to the person. So we see with our brains. I know a lot of people might think, oh, we see with our eyes, but we actually see with our brains. And this is a study from Lofty Mirabet, who we closely collaborate with here in the US and the Boston area in particular. This is an image of a brain, visual system, and all those connections, those bright connections. And this is an image of what it might be like for a CVI brain. So you can see the connections aren't all there, which again goes back to kind of lacking in visual functioning that we see in our kids with CVI. Someone can have 20/20 vision and be functionally blind. So with CVI, our brains have difficulty recognizing and making sense of the world. This is to show kind of the McKinsey and Company study I talked about a few slides back that we teamed up with at Perkins. They found that less than 20% of individuals in the US have been diagnosed with CVI. So that's a huge number. So of the 180,000 kids, only about 25,000 of them had been identified. And this was a 2023 study. So CVI is commonly associated with CP, epilepsy, developmental delay, autism, genetics. The other common reasons it can happen is HIE, meningitis, brain injury, or stroke. There's a wide range of genetics that we're still, I think, probably uncovering that are impacting kids to have both a rare disease and CVI. And commonly, there's people with CVI often have other ocular conditions, including refractive errors and strabismus and nystagmus. I know for my daughter, she has both. She has an astigmatism and she's farsighted and she wears glasses for those, but those are not correcting her CVI. They're only giving her a little bit more clarity. So at Perkins, we look at the 16 visual behaviors and compensatory skills that our students are using. This is a lot of how we're assessing kids, where visual attention and visual recognition are kind of the overarching visual behaviors that all of these really fall into. So, when we're thinking about assessing our kids, we're looking at what kind of form is best for them, or do they benefit from light, or do they benefit from motion, or how are they moving through space? How are they reaching out for things? And some of these categories are just the way we're looking at our students. And then the compensatory skills, of course. So a lot of individuals with CVI rely on context and memory, predictability, color coding, tactile skills, smell, auditory skills, verbal labels. I think of this, the example I like to give of my daughter is she's a wheelchair user and she's non-speaking, but she's very good at predicting her routines because they happen so often in our home. And even predicting when we're going to, when we put her in her chair for feeding, she starts kind of getting anxious, hitting her tray, salivating, all things showing me that she knows it's time to eat. And then another example would be when I put her on the floor, she's immediately reaching out for her chimes to play with, or her toys. Sometimes it's her cat piano, because she knows where it's supposed to be. And you'll see her, really search for it with her arms more than her vision if it's not exactly where it should be. So when we think about when to suspect CVI, some of the things you might observe is an individual might look at things differently. So they might have trouble looking at something pointed out at a distance, or notice something only when it lights up. They might have trouble recognizing objects, maybe not noticing something new that you've brought into their attention. They might miss things in their certain visual fields, or need verbal cues, like there's still food on the left side of your plate. That could be a good example. They might have trouble interacting with people, so they might only recognize someone when they hear their voice. Another example I could use with my daughter would be that, when she's a student here at campus, and sometimes if I go for a walk outside, I might run into her, and she would not know that it was me unless I said hello to her, or when I pick her up, or certain things of that nature. Individuals with CVI might not return a social smile, or they might have a hard time making eye contact, or miss gestures like high fives. You might notice that fatigue. They might seem overwhelmed when there's too many things to look at, or overly tired at the end of the day. And again, an example I could give of my own child is that we try to schedule her specials, like her vision services and her speech services in the morning, because by the end of the day, she's done. You might notice somebody having trouble at meal times, so finding food on their plate, or eating in a busy environment. And I could say another example is, accommodation that we have for our daughter also is to eat in her classroom, because the cafeteria is too overwhelming for her, and we're focused on our nutrition more than anything. You might also see somebody struggle with school or other tasks, so appear to have a shorter attention span, maybe not seem as interested in learning, or maybe frustrated with learning tasks. They may be reluctant to join or to participate in a group if it's noisy or busy. Even in our parent community, there was a conversation about just what it's like in what is the term? Early morning gatherings. It's too much for this child. And so, she reached out to try to get recommendations. So this is a thing that happens for a lot of our kiddos. You might see somebody having trouble navigating steps, tripping over clearly visible things, bumping into furniture. A lot of times when we're really observing a child, like going down steps, you might see them dragging their heels against the back of the step, or pausing or tapping their toes when they're at a landing to make sure that there's no more steps. So those are just some examples, and I know hopefully I'm not rushing too quick, but we want to leave time for questions. But those are just some examples of what you might observe, but Allie will share some of our resources in a bit. So it can be hard to get a diagnosis, as many of you may or may not know. Like Leanne said, her daughter was just diagnosed this year, Allie and I have both been fortunate that our children were diagnosed pretty early in their lives, but a lot of that I think had to do with, for my daughter, it had to do with her, like her birth history. She has a pretty significant birth history. Plus, we live in the Boston area where there's a lot of doctors who are comfortable diagnosing CVI. Plus, we know a lot more now, so hopefully more kids are captured sooner and sooner. But there's really no agreed upon diagnostic medical evaluation. Not all doctors are familiar with CVI or comfortable diagnosing it. There's a lot of diagnostic overshadowing, especially in the medically complex individuals. And it really can resemble a lot of other conditions such as autism or ADHD. And I think people know about those conditions more, so they immediately go, this kid has autism or this kid has ADHD, even though they could have both. You know, I think we would like everyone to think about the visual axis and what this means to individuals with CVI. So if you're listening, you've never heard of CVI, but you're hearing about it, and then you're starting to see some things that make you wonder, I wonder if my child has CVI. Some of the next steps we suggest is like refer to a neuro-ophthalmologist, an ophthalmologist, an optometrist, or even a neurologist who is able to evaluate and diagnose CVI. We do have a doctor directory. It is primarily US based, and it's not in every state yet. So if you know of doctors who have diagnosed your children that might want to be listed, please reach out. When your child or when the individual is at getting a medical eye check, they're going to look for other eye conditions to make sure that it's not, you know, something caused by the ocular structure, and to make sure the symptoms must not be solely explained by other eye health conditions or vision problems really related to the eye. We always say if you see something off with your child or an individual with CVI, recording how they're behaving in their environments might be a good way to share with others to kind of help them understand if this is maybe CVI or not. And you can also reach out in the US at least to early intervention. I know it's primarily 0 to 3 in the US. I know some go a little bit longer, but to ask them for somebody who can come out and do a functional vision evaluation and a CVI assessment. And for school age, same thing. You can reach out to the school team and request that there's a functional vision evaluation, CVI assessment, a learning media assessment, and an orientation and mobility assessment. So CVI voices. So we're very lucky to learn from a lot in our community who've shared what it's like for them to how they experience CVI. So what we know, is vision can be affected by both internal and external states. It's really hard work for most of these individuals. It's unreliable, and there are many ways to access information. It's not just about vision. I think when my daughter was even littler, I was so focused on her using her visual skills that, I wasn't focused on her using compensatory skills the way that she does now. And some of our kids use vision, some use non-visual skills, and some of them use both. So whatever way they're learning, as long as they have an opportunity, is kind of my motto. So what is CVI like? No two people with CVI have the same experience. Nye's perspective, they share that information is landing on their eyes, but they're unable to make sense of light or of it. Light in certain colors may enter their awareness, but determining where one object ends and the next begins is difficult. So Nye's sharing that clutter really impacts them, and there are just certain things that make it more difficult for them to see. Dogwort shared when she's fatigued, her vision is comparable to looking through a straw. These are both adults so far that I've spoke about. One CVI's perspective is when it's hot out, he receives reduced visual feedback from his brain. Krish is a younger child, but his perspective is that his lower field loss means he cannot see below eye level. This impacts a lot of our kids with CVI. Almir's perspective is recognizing and understanding faces and facial expressions is difficult for him to visually process. Another one uses color as a way to help him recognize and remember particular objects or people. And sometimes parents will pick up on that. Like they recognize me better when I have a bright colored shirt, or they might say it's easier to find you in a crowd if you're wearing red or yellow or whatever bright color that they might want. So that is my portion for now, and Allie's going to share some of our general supports and adaptations for CVI.
Thanks, Lacey. So yes, just as Lacey said, I want to discuss a little bit about general supports and adaptations for CVI. Kind of like anything else, when we're talking about adaptations and modifications, there's no really one size fits all. It is going to all be individualized. So just kind of to keep that in mind, that this is very like an overarching, you can try this with your loved one, with your child. If it works, that's wonderful. If it doesn't work, it's not going to hurt them. But it's a place to kind of get started and understand what some adaptations and modifications might look like. Lacey, are you able to go to the next slide? Perfect. So the first thing, as Lacey kind of already mentioned, clutter can really impact somebody with CVI. Oops, are you able to go back one? Sorry. So clutter can really impact somebody with CVI. So reducing that visual clutter is really important. So as you can see in the top picture, the focus is to like look at that book that the person's reading, but really the individuals with CVI might not be able to focus with all the clutter in the background. And a simple solution is just to cover up that clutter. It could be with something simple like a black tablecloth, really whatever you have at home. It doesn't necessarily have to be black, but you don't want to hang up like a printed lots of different color blanket. That might be very difficult as well. Just something to kind of cover over all the clutter. And that way the person with CVI can focus directly on that one image in the book instead of having to, really put their head down and try to see what's going on, as we talked about with the NI's perspective. And Lacey, if you can go to the next one. So supportive positioning and presenting materials in accessible visual field. So this is going to be a little bit more individualized. What does supportive positioning look like for your loved one? That bottom right chair, my son didn't have that particular one, but growing up, he did have a little one very similar to that, where it really provided a lot of support for him. There was buckles in the front when he was just learning to sit up, to kind of take all of that extra pressure off. He doesn't have to work on his muscles at that point if we want him to focus on vision, because doing more than one task at one time with CVI can be quite challenging. So whatever type of supportive positioning your loved one needs is something to consider when you want them to do a visual task. And presenting visuals in an accessible visual field. For example, my son has his best visual field is actually his lower visual field, which is a bit unusual and also off to the right. So when we're feeding him or presenting materials to him, we are below him and off to the right because that's where he sees. So sometimes he prefers to stand up because then he can see down below better. So whatever works for your individual or loved one with CVI, I'm not sure, if it's left, right, up or down, whatever the visual field is, but you want to use that to their advantage and present the materials in that visual field. And the next one is intentional use of color. So for example, this very first picture is using red tape to highlight the step up or just stairs or threshold in general. This is something that we have all throughout our house on any stairs. We have, I think ours is yellow tape in every stair in the house. It doesn't have to be a particular color. You just want it to be a high contrast, whatever you want to highlight. So for example, that next picture shows a black placemat with a red plate on it. Whatever you have at home could work as well. Like if you have a dark colored placemat and, a different color bowl or plate where you're going to really see that contrast pop. It can really help an individual with CVI focus more on what they're looking at. Some of these other pictures, it's really going to pertain to what works best for your child. For example, my son can't use light switches, so that wouldn't particularly pertain to him. But I know lots of individuals who do use light switches, so highlighting it with glitter around it is very helpful. So really kind of you would want to think about what are some of the activities and tasks that your child does at home, at school, and how can you use color intentionally to highlight that for them to make it a little bit easier. And intentional use of light. So same thing with light. Sometimes we find individuals with CVI really benefit from additional light sources. So like this very first picture is, focusing on that left object. I think there's a flashlight focusing in on it so that they can really focus right on that. Or we find that iPads often, help, just that lit up screen is really helpful. So that's a really easy one to try out as well if you're doing a learning task or any type of task. It could be meal, whatever it might be that your child or loved one is working on. If you want to just test it out with some light and see if it helps or not. It's a really easy one to see. My son, for example, really, really gravitates toward anything on the iPad. It's kind of interesting to see how he will then put his head like closer to the iPad to really look at it in a very different way than he looks at something else. I think that light just speaks to him. He's also, I should say, he's also nonverbal. So I'm following his cues based on, what he's doing, if that makes sense. And the next one is, so reduce noise, movement, and other distractions. So I know Lacey mentioned, she doesn't have her child eat in the cafeteria. That, it's also very common that distractions and noise can really come into play for an individual with CVI. My son's very similar. I have 2 other little kids at home and he can't eat when they're eating because they're just too noisy. So we actually have to feed him privately in a separate room. For learning tasks, it's not uncommon that, a large classroom with multiple people and noise might be challenging for somebody with CVI. I know both Lacey's child and my child have very small classrooms, and that's because that's what they benefit from, that reduced noise, reduced distraction, reduced clutter, all of those things, which are really beneficial to them. And I think there's one more, which is a multisensory approach to learning. And I know Lacey mentioned this a little bit as well, utilizing different senses. CVI obviously is a visual impairment. So while individuals are using their vision, it also can be helpful to utilize some other senses as well. So, whether that be, you can see the music in the background or tactile, touching to feel, what the objects are. So a multisensory approach to learning, I'm thinking of, for example, we have a cat in our house. Instead of me just saying, look at the cat, I take my son's hand and I let him touch the cat and feel the cat and listen to the cat's noise meowing, and really for him to get that full sensory experience of what is a cat, not beyond the vision, just for him, so that he understands a little bit more in depth what that is. And next slide. So I'm going to go over some of the resources and supports we have at CVI Now for CVI families and individuals. Okay, so our site is cvinow.org, and it has lots of articles, lots of resources. We're constantly adding to it. Here I'm just highlighting some of the kind of basic ones getting started, like what is CVI and understanding those visual behaviors and what assessments are. But then we have, more targeted articles such as CVI and rare disease or epilepsy and CVI explained. We have a whole article, and a couple of them now, on CVI in adults. We're starting to get lots of information from adults. We're having adults reach out to us to talk about their experiences. So that's kind of something that's also growing on our site. But this site is used not just for caregivers and parents, but also for professionals as well. I'll get into that a little bit more, but it's a place to come if you're looking for supports or help with advocacy for your child or a student. Some of the things that I think are also make it really special, we have a CVI Now Parent Caregiver Facebook group. This is run by Lacey, and I think it just recently hit over 3,000 members worldwide, which is really exciting. It has a lot of great discussion. It's a very active group. Lacey is really great at responding to every comment on there. So it's a great place to join. We hope you guys do join if you're not already in it. And we also offer a free one-to-one CVI parent or caregiver support session. That's also with Lacey, which again, I think is such a special thing. She is a teacher of students with visual impairments. And so oftentimes, people that want to connect maybe didn't have access to a TVI, or maybe, want to bounce some ideas off or get some individualized support, and whatever the reason may be, like, she is there to help support you. And so if that's something you're looking for, that's a link you can click and sign up and have that individual session with her. Next slide. We have a whole series on early intervention. If you are fortunate enough to get a diagnosis, during that time of early intervention, it's still challenging to navigate and kind of, know what to expect in early intervention and how to have all your providers work together with your CVI diagnosis or suspected CVI diagnosis. So this is a great series to kind of learn a little bit more about it and learn some tips and help better advocate for your child. And the next slide. We also have an IEP guide. So, once your child is hitting that age of, going to school, you're going to start thinking about that IEP or individualized education program. And that is quite a journey, especially if you have CVI. It really is it can be a complex thing to put together for a child with CVI, and it can be a lot. I remember for me when I started, like, it was almost, where do I begin? And so having a guide where it takes into account CVI and all of those things is really, really helpful. It really breaks it down for you guys. So I really encourage anybody who has a child in the school age system and wants a little bit more information on that to check out this guide. And the next slide. Like I said before, we have a whole section of stories from adults with CVI. We recently even had a CVI Awareness Day in the state of Massachusetts, and we've heard from several adults there as well. So we'll be adding to this as well in the near future as well. So I think it's great. While we are a school, we also have individualized articles that pertains to adults. And the next slide. We have a series on do-it-yourself for accessibility. This is one that I always think is really interesting, just to kind of see what other people have done for ideas in their home. It could be kitchen, living room, bathroom, like what have they done for their child to adapt these spaces or modify these spaces for their CVI. Again, it's going to be very individualized because every individual with CVI is very unique. They all have different things going on medically. But I just think it's really interesting to see what other people do, and it kind of gives me ideas as well. So I encourage you all to take a look at this one as well. And the next slide. So we do focus on the lived CVI experiences here at CVI Now. So these articles are some, articles of lived experiences with those with CVI. Looking at the very first one, how does heat affect CVI? That little guy on the left is my Weston. And while he can't tell me, I can tell you that heat definitely affects his CVI. When it's hot out, he continually puts his hands over his eyes and his head down, and he just really kind of melts and stays on the ground and doesn't want to do anything. So it's really interesting to see these articles and really hear what it's like for individuals with CVI. And next slide. We do have several downloadable resources on our site, both in English and in Spanish. This first one is just a basic, one pager on CVI. It's really helpful to, if you're in a situation maybe like with a medical provider where they're not familiar with it, you can hand them this, or in your education system, if somebody isn't familiar with CVI or an early intervention, it's just a nice one pager where you can hand it to them and they can briefly, quickly understand a little bit more about it. And then, they can go to the links later on and to learn a little bit more. But sometimes we find that, there are people who are in the education system and they might not have heard of this. And so it's helpful to have. And so I encourage you all to download this and have that accessible for any meetings that you might need it for. And we have another one, which is after this slide, when to suspect CVI. This is a one pager. There's a front and a back to this one. So the front are, some of these signs that you should look for when you want to suspect CVI. And on the back side, it's the next steps, both medical next steps that we encourage you to take, as well as the educational next steps. So that's really helpful if you are thinking your child might have CVI. I encourage you all to take a look at this. And the next one is we have a one-pager on CVI and epilepsy. There's a high prevalence of kids in that study that we did, age 0 to 22, having epilepsy and CVI. So we made a specific one-pager just for this, where it kind of talks specifically about CVI and epilepsy. And same thing on the back, it's when to suspect as well. And the next slide. We have an educators hub at CVI Now, which I think is really, really unique and special. So we are here not just for, students and individuals, parents with as caregivers with CVI, but also for educators as well. So our educators hub provides, it's a nice space for educators to come and network and share resources. So they do have a place to go if they have a child with CVI and want to learn more. I think that's a really lovely thing for them to have access to. And then we also have a CVI Now Educators Facebook community. So kind of like that private caregiver community, this one is private for the educators. So they can join that and connect with each other. And we also have the Perkins CVI Intervention Library. It's a collection of strategies for anyone supporting students with CVI. It can be both educational and the home setting. So for example, my son in school, all of his providers are very familiar with CVI. He does attend Perkins, but outside of school, he has an autism diagnosis and he gets ABA services outside at our home. And his ABA provider had never heard of CVI. And so I was able to share this with her, and she was able to go to these sites and learn a little bit more. One of the great things is it's broken down by discipline. So she could go and see something called like CVI for the ABA. There's a CVI for, SLPs or OTs, PTs. So every discipline, so they can hop onto the site and kind of learn a little bit more about CVI and how to work with a child with CVI. We also have the Perkins CVI protocol. So this was created by the CVI Center at Perkins, and it is an evaluation tool designed to help TVIs create a robust, individualized CVI evaluation with recommendations for that student. While it is for TVIs, it's something that anyone can download. It is free and customizable. It is grounded in science. So even if your child, for example, is in school and needs a CVI assessment, this is something you could always, let them know about. Like you could ask if their TVI wanted to take a look at the CVI protocol to do that type of evaluation for them. And next slide. So we're actually having another webinar coming up. We just wanted to let you guys know about it. October 21st, 12 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, recognizing CVI in the rare disease community. We just want to make you all aware, just in case you wanted to do a little bit more and hear a little bit more about this. We do a whole rare disease outreach campaign at the CVI Center because we are seeing that it's popping up in lots of rare diseases. And since both Lacey and I have children with rare disease, it's kind of been a passion of ours to thoughtfully reach out to these communities that have CVI in their community and offer supports. And I think we might have one more slide. Just that we want to thank you for your time. And if you have questions, we would love to answer some of them.